Going to do is provide you with what I hope is going to be a brief and functional overview. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the International Science Council. I'm on the governing board of that organization. I will then speak with you a little bit about the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. I am the co-chair of that committee. I then want to spend just one slide, but I think it's probably the most important slide, sharing with you my perspective on social justice. And the reason I think this is important is that it's become a concept that people are now familiar with and use, and yet very often when they unpack this concept, it sounds to me, as a philosopher, more like distributive justice. And there's a really important difference, and I want you to hold on to that difference and to continue to advocate for social justice. From there, we're actually going to move to the panel, which is this focus on barriers to access and opportunities. And basically what I'm hoping is that each of the panelists is going to share with you some of the challenges that one faces in achieving some of the goals we have in terms of social justice. We'll have a conversation with those in the room. Sorry to those of you who are online who won't be able to engage in that kind of way. But then we want to actually move towards the end of this panel to really concrete solutions, not big picture vague solutions, because we've had those for probably 30 years. What we really need are small but incremental steps that we can actually action. And so that really is going to be the focus of the last part of the presentation. So first, the International Science Council. I think the important thing to appreciate is that it's a global membership organization, and the members are some of the scientific unions, some of the national academies of science, etc. And I think the thing to appreciate is that in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively new organization, founded in 2018 by the merger of two well-established and well-respected organizations. One of them focused on the natural sciences, the other focused on the social sciences, and I think you'll all appreciate that in a contemporary context, we've long recognized that it's not productive to think that these two can be in fact, advantaged or moved forward separately, that they are inextricably intertwined. And in fact, the creation of the International Science Council is the instantiation of that recognition. An important thing to appreciate is that the International Science Council, I think, has a key underlying principle or guiding value, and that's this notion that science is a global public good. And in some sense, that's about saying that science belongs to all of us, and more importantly, that we should all be reaping the benefits of science. And so you'll see there a couple of excerpts from some of our documents emphasizing the importance of understanding science as an inclusive and equitable activity, both in the production of knowledge, but also then the sharing of the fruits of that knowledge. And so one of the things that I think is really important is for us to be able to capitalize on talent wherever we find it. And in the context of this conference, I want to emphasize that I think that talent is in the room, not just on the stage. And so I think it's really important to appreciate that, if you will, overlying or underlying commitment. But the important thing is, how do you take that commitment and turn it into something that's actionable? I think what you have here is a very clear, quick overview of the action plan for the International Science Council. And you'll see the last item, which I've highlighted, is freedom and responsibility in science. And as I mentioned, that's the committee that I co-chair. Very briefly, I think what's important to appreciate here is this fundamental commitment to the human right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And I have put in italics the title of the UNESCO recommendation below, because that's in fact where those words come from. And it's to say that it's something that we and a number of other organizations are committed to amplifying. But if you see and you look at the documents that reiterate this constant commitment, they're not recent. And they keep getting repeated. And so the point of this conference is, how do we get beyond that? How do we get beyond just publishing documents that reiterate the same thing? And how can we make for change? Well, our view is that one of the ways of making for change is to share concrete stories about the barriers that people face, and ultimately concrete actions that can make for a difference. The principle of freedom and responsibility in science is entrenched in the work of the International Science Council. sorry, it jumped ahead of me, is entrenched in the work of the International Science Council, and then more specifically the committee that I co-chair. And I would just emphasize for you the words that are in bold. It requires freedom of movement, association, expression, and communication. It requires equitable access to data, information, and other resources. And this work has to go forward with integrity, respect, fairness, trustworthiness, and transparency. I mean, if we could do all of that, the world would be a better place. Now, here's the one slide that I promised you on social justice. This builds on my work and the work of other philosophers. But the important thing to appreciate is that this is not just about the distribution of goods. It's about the recognition that there is systemic injustice. And that's what's hard, because you're actually looking to change cultural systems that have embedded in them structures that continue to disadvantage sections of the population. And if you'll permit me, the one slide where I'll do a little bit of karaoke, and that's to read a quote from a work of mine that I published after the first experience with SARS. I was living in Canada, and SARS-1 had a devastating impact on one of our major cities, Toronto. And I'd started to do work in public health at that time, and that work was very much grounded in a commitment to solidarity and understanding of social justice. And so my karaoke. Social justice directs us to explore the context in which certain political and social structures are created and maintained, and in which certain policy decisions are made and implemented. It asks us to look beyond effects on individuals and to see how members of different social groups may be collectively affected by private and public practices that create inequalities in access and opportunity. And that's really what this session is about, inequalities in access and opportunity. And our panelists are going to share some of their insights and thoughts about that. And then the challenge for all of us is concrete ideas about how to move forward on that. Before I move to the panel, though, I want to do something a little bit different, which is you're all here because you presumably have an interest in the theme. And what I want to make sure is that we have some ideas and thoughts from the audience before we even move to the panel. And so I'm going to give you a second to think, and I have the microphone. And if anybody here has something they'd like to say with respect to their understanding of what social justice requires of us, or their understanding of ways in which you have seen social injustice or things that you think might be worth attending to, I'm going to ask you to share that with us, partly because then it can also help our panelists make sure that in their comments, they're responding to things that are real for you. So do I have any takers on this invitation? Sure, just a moment. Thank you. We have people online. Thanks.
I can walk to the next person. Well, I think when I look at the definitions that you give here, I don't know the persons who give these definitions, but sometimes I think social justice is looked at so universally, as if there is one way of thinking about it. By universal, I mean also Western or not, more from the North kind of perspectives. But I'm really wondering if this also takes into account social justice from different other communities. What would that concept be? Would it be the same? Would it be the same definition that we have here?
So I'm one of the authors, so I'll take responsibility for my words. I'm Baylis, so the first author in the middle paragraph there. And I think that, at least in terms of my own work, I'm hoping that it's a global perspective insofar as I recognize this kind of injustice happens across borders, across cultures, within cultures. I think there are minorities within majorities, but there are also minorities within minorities. And I think it's an attempt to really name a concern that we ought to be having to sort of say, what are the structures? And so I think those structures are going to be different in different parts of the world. And so it's for people locally to identify what those structures are. But I think that's the part that's meant to be universal. It's about saying there are systems and structures in place that don't advantage everybody equally. So I can only take responsibility for my words, but that would be the hope, that it can be personalized and individualized to a particular situation, but universal in terms of recognizing that part of the problem is systems and structures. There was a person behind you. Maybe you could share the microphone.
Thank you. My thoughts about social justice or science for social justice in the South African context is the fact that our democratic constitution, which is fairly new, it was published in 1996. For the first time, the South Africans could enjoy the national value of social justice, which is equitable opportunities for all. In particular, in science, equitable opportunities in science for all. Because in the past, we had a government that specifically said other race groups are not supposed to participate in science. And therefore, for us as South Africans, in particular the disadvantaged, the social justice in science means a lot. And in other words, it's a matter. I like the last sentence of the slide that says social justice enjoins us to correct patterns of systematic injustices. Because we had injustices in science, we're not supposed to participate in science as blacks. And therefore, for me and for the people like me in South Africa, it's a case of science needs to take into cognizance that the disadvantaged have been pushed out of science, and therefore there should be aggressive efforts to correct that, especially in the field of science, not politically, but in the field of science.
Great, thanks for those comments. Does anybody on the panel want to say anything, or should we just take a few more comments and start our panel? Okay, anyone? Sorry, we're just going to move out. So we'll take these two more comments, and then we'll start with our panel. Thanks. Oh, and thank you. I wrote that last line too.
Thank you. Thank you for your brief presentation. This quote you just showed us by Young, social justice is concerned with fair access to social goods such as rights, power, and self-respect. I find it extremely dangerous. It had nothing to do with justice in society, in my view. First of all, consider rights, right to life, right to vote, all those human rights we know, and self-respect, humanity, something good, something as a social good, just like goods and services, like commodities. I think that is not a good way of description. And power is not right. There is no such thing as the right to power. If you accept something like power as right, or something as social good, that's not good. So if I were a referee evaluating this publication, I would not have given him any credit. Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll take one more comment, and then we'll start with the panel.
Yes, thank you very much for providing this opportunity to the audience to start. That's unusual. Thank you. I am Lydia Borrell-Demian. I'm from Science Europe. It's an organization in Europe that represents national funding and performing organizations. And I am no philosopher, and I don't know much about social justice, so I came here to learn, and I hope I will learn a lot. I already learned a lot. And I am impressed by your definition and also by your courage in tackling such a very tricky subject. Because for me, social justice it depends so much on the cultural country difference. I mean, we here, probably in this room, I hope, despite of all defects in our societies, we advocate for example, equity between men and women, just to oversimplify. But in some other cultures, the justice is that there is a clear division of roles. And that means not equal opportunities, that means many other consequences. So I don't know, I just wanted to share this reflection because to me the concept of social justice is very slippery when we go deep into it.
Great. Well, thank you for those excellent comments. The goal now is to go through some presentations from our panelists who are going to share some personal experiences and hopefully identify some barriers or challenges to the pursuit and achieving the goals of social justice. And then we'll come back and have some more comments in terms of some of what they will have shared with us, and then go back to the panel again. So I'm going to start with Carisha on my right, and ask her to share some of her thoughts with you.
Thanks very much, Francois, and greetings, friends and colleagues. It's a real honor and privilege to be part of this very eminent panel and to share personal perspectives. So the one I wanted to share with all of you. So firstly, I'm a South African. I'm 62 years old. And I lived through democracy. And if we had all day, I could give you any number of examples. I've been an HIV scientist and an epidemiologist for about 34 years. And I wanted to focus some of my experiences on that because I think it cuts across Sustainable Development Goals 3 and 5. So in 1990, actually it was in 1989, I had just returned from completing my master's degree at Columbia University, where I came face to face, literally in the classroom and on the streets with AIDS. And I was very struck with the differences in the way AIDS was being manifested, whether it was in the East part, East Village, or in Harlem, or the Bronx. And secondly, in my classes, it was shortly after the discovery of HIV, the development of diagnostic kits, but there was a lot of debate about, firstly, who had discovered HIV, and secondly, does HIV cause AIDS? And on my return, and the other thing that I noted in my classes was we had people from different parts of Africa, but particularly in West Africa and Central and East Africa, describing the epidemic there. And I said, well, I'm from South Africa, and I remember in 1982, 83, working in an immunology lab, and we had as the first reports of HIV was being described in North America, there were many concerned men who have sex with men would come to our lab to have various tests and just try and understand this emerging epidemic, which we didn't appreciate at that stage. There was one, but two, there were about 100 individuals who had received blood and blood products through unscreened blood products prior to the diagnostic tests being developed. And so beyond that, there was very little information except for some migrant workers coming to the mines and being tested once the diagnostic tests became available and being sent back to the neighboring Southern African countries. And that triggered a human rights response led by Justice Edwin Cameron around workplace stigma and discrimination. But in 1989, I had no idea what was going on. And as an epidemiologist, you want to understand first the magnitude of the problem. I did a population-based survey, and I found that women had 4 times more infection than men in this large population-based survey. And secondly, that women acquired HIV infection about 4 to 7 years before men did. So it was between 15 to 24 years, we were seeing about 6% HIV infection against an overall less than 1% prevalence. And then if you compare that, it was rare in the male peers. We only started to see infection in men in their mid-20s. So I very rapidly prepared the manuscript and sent it off to the South African Medical Journal. That was the primary journal we had because we were respecting the academic sanctions that were in place at that stage. And I learned very quickly the SMJ rejected it. But it was shortly after the release of the extra parliamentary parties and the start of a negotiated settlement and move towards democracy in South Africa. So sanctions were being lifted. And I sent this to the journal AIDS for publication. And I got a fax back. Now, some of you are old enough to remember faxes and so on. Fax back saying, we're going to publish this in 2 weeks' time on a fast track basis, because this was such a significant observation. But for the next 20 years or so, I would continue to have this battle with many scientists, particularly from the North, about this age-sex difference as an important driver of the epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. I continued to fight that battle by continuing to consistently generate the data and equivocally showing this with phylogenetics in 2016. But importantly also, I started to work, as I did the socio-epidemiological studies, I understood women didn't have many options. And because everything we had depended on male cooperation. And as I did these interviews with women in different settings, I got to appreciate not that they didn't understand what their risk was, they understood that completely. But what the issue was, the real social challenge, was their inability to negotiate condom use with the partner or have the partner have an HIV test. And as time went on, to actually, be initiated on ARV treatment for their benefit. And the things continued, but the woman said, well, why don't you as a scientist develop a method that I can use to protect myself? And so that's how I started the Women-Initiated Technology Research, and others joined along, and there were many of us working on this. And it took us nearly 18 years before we had the first proof of concept. Lots of failures, but all I'll say is that in 2021, every 2 minutes, one woman between the ages of 15 to 24 years in sub-Saharan Africa gets infected with HIV. So although we've made much progress scientifically, we have a long road to go before we can realize at least some of those scientific advances. So I'm going to stop there, Francois, but happy to continue further on that theme of gender, HIV, and what are lessons we can draw from that on social justice and science.
Well, thanks very much. And our next speaker, I'm going to bellow, is Sass. Yeah, great.
Okay. I dare say that it could only possibly be this country that could have had the theme that this World Science Forum is based on. Because the issues of social justice are very far from most of our disciplines, and we, in many of our areas, latter-day adherence to the concepts of social justice. So I'm just going to give a few ideas out there. And those,
Excuse me, Sass, can you pull
oh,
closer to
and those come from personal experience. I'm not going to deal with anything theoretical and so on. The first is the exclusion. My fellow countrywoman raised the issue of exclusion. And in nearly every discipline, there was exclusion in the society. So that to catch up is massively difficult, except in one or two areas where there's beginning to be close to parity. in almost all areas, the white minority still continues to dominate most of the disciplines and professions and scientific endeavors. That's one. So in 1983, I get out of prison and decide I'm going to get a profession. I gave up law because I was not going to come out of prison and pay allegiance to a corrupt, oppressive, and repressive apartheid state. And lo and behold, nearly every place I applied to had all sorts of requirements. And when they discovered that, by the way, I passed the degree with distinction, I became a prized possession. But also, I became a prized possession because people wanted to see what made this guy tick. Because you spend 9 years in prison and now you come out, and shouldn't you be a politician? Shouldn't you be somewhere else but in psychology? And ultimately, and right here UCT, the person who was responsible for the clinical psychology program said to me in a telephone call after the selection, "We've decided to take a chance on you." Of course, I got my PhD. I don't think he even has a PhD now. I decided to remain at WITS, where I was precluded from going into any facility that was run by the state because I would be a threat to their patients. So I was banned from going into any psychiatric facility. Then it became an issue for the WITS psychology department to find me an internship, and it became an itinerant one. There too, I ended up, finishing a master's, all but dissertation, and then getting a Fulbright scholarship and going into Boston. I come back and find that there were restrictions in so many areas. I was threatened with not being enrolled as a psychologist, but with the judgment in the Biko matter, and we were close students and allies. The HPCSA eventually said, yes, we'll enroll you, because there was apparently disgraceful conduct in opposing apartheid. Be that as it may, I end up doing all the things I have done, including going into the international arena, playing a role in ICSU, and being very committed, that's ICSU, to the issues of freedom and responsibility in science. That becomes something that's taken over into my discipline, psychology. And the International Union uses the phraseology of ICSU and now the ISC. However, I must say that over the last 12 or so years, these issues have become really heavy to deal with because most people oppose it. Being trained in the West, and psychology is a Western-dominated discipline, even when the decolonial movement began here, the Rhodes Must Fall and decolonization movement, the American Psychology Association writes and says, is this not anti-science? Because it becomes a threat to them. So there's the issue of what many of us call epistemicide, because you want to destroy native knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and impose your own views on the world. Most developed societies believe they are democratic, but actually have not integrated into their daily living the ethos of democracy. And so many Western countries actually fail to recognize human rights for what they are. On the 10th of this month, it'll be 74 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. But if you look at how those are expressed in the reality, in social and other processes in society, very few countries actually express them and live them. So the issues that the Committee for Freedom and Science, Freedom and Responsibility in Science, has tended to face traditionally has been visa exclusions. And lo and behold, the countries that are most prominent in visa exclusions are who? The USA, Canada, a few like that. And yet, these are supposed to be bastions of equality and so on. Till today, to the chagrin of most scientific leaders who cannot impact on their own governments in this regard, woefully, my own country tends to follow the same path recently, with the rise in well, it's called xenophobia, but really it's Afrophobia. Because anybody else but those who look natively African are allowed into the country. And yet, just last month, the Department of International Relations could not give a visa to a colleague to come from Botswana here because he was a native of Ghana. If he was in Ghana, he would have been able to come here. So it's things like that where our leadership tend to buy into the Western ethos in thinking about ourselves. We cannot get away from our common humanity. Our biology is the same. And the sooner we begin to recognize and cherish that we are a diverse but one human family, the sooner we'll be able to get over our own prejudices. My input today was fashioned on to boycott or question mark. And recently with the war in the Ukraine, there's been a major push to just isolate colleagues in Russia, even when they have made statements against the war and have not participated. In Europe, I mean, the First World War, the Second World War, they've been basically European wars. And now we confront a third European war. So my question, having come from a devoutly anti-apartheid position, it says in one of the scriptures, when I was a child, I spake it as a child, but now that I'm a man, I need to confront that and say, what's the value of boycott? Should I boycott Nuri because of his political system or where he's located geopolitically? Is it not time that we build bridges? Our job is to build bridges, not blow up the bridges. And we should continue to do that. When science becomes politically loaded, as it tends to be in terms of how science gets funded with the gross inequalities, we need to rise above the narrowness that takes us backward. Yes, we can talk about equity, equality, and justice, but can we overcome the marks of our origin and truly believe in our common humanity?
Thank you, Seth. Moving on to our next panelist, DA.
So thank you for having me today. I'm very glad to be here for this session. So today I'm going to talk about gender equality. There are not enough young women in science and in tech industry. And those who are in tech industry, they didn't stay in tech industry. And this is what I observed in Senegal, in my country, and by doing some research, I saw it in France, US. So in 2019, the Ministry of Digital Economy and Telecommunication of Senegal wrote a study report on digital startup and SMA. And in this report, they're writing that 85% of companies in Senegal are led by men against 50% by women. So it's a digital company. And according to the same report, this gap is a reflection of the low rate of women in higher education, particularly in science and technology stream. So let me introduce myself. I run a company in Senegal and in Ivory Coast on digital services, and I did my whole career in science. So I'm an engineer in computer science. I have my PhD in machine learning algorithm, and I used to work on technology in France and in Senegal. And during my journey, I saw a lot of obstacles for a young woman from Senegal like me could have to access to science. So I'm going to talk about 5 obstacles. The first one is from an early age, a young girl didn't see representation to project themselves on tech industry. In children books, cartoons, you didn't see young black geek, and it is a problem. The second one is there is no role model in society. The few women who do science and evolve in tech industry in Senegal do not communicate. We don't hear them. We don't see them in the press. There is no promotion of this kind of woman. They prefer do the promotion of people. Yeah. 3, there is a cultural and religious aspect. For example, in Senegal, they say the value of the woman is just to be to be under the man. So the woman depend on the father, and then they depend on the husband, and it is normal for them. Yeah, for them. She is not safe alone abroad to study and to attend conference like this. So women must found and take care of home. This is a priority. And the socio-cultural realities are projected in the ICT ecosystem, where the image of the man will be more valued and even dominant. So the next obstacle I saw was in tech industry. There is a lot of sexism. So I didn't really have a number in Senegal, but when I used to work in France, they say about 46% of women in tech say they have already been victims of sexism behavior, discrimination, humiliating, threatening, or violent remark. And the last one is education. For example, in our country, the education of women is very different from that of men in our country. So women are asked to be very perfect. Women will find it harder to share ID. There is a certain fear of failure and judgment that makes them not take risk. And so you can see lack of confidence, imposter syndrome, and I can see that in my teams every time during meeting when they have to speak up about they can't.
Okay.
Our next speaker is George, and he's going to try and get that slide up for you. There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me first thank the International Science Council for bringing me onto this panel to speak. And what I want to do with my time is to lift the discussion onto the international plane, where we should be concerned about social justice and find solutions to addressing the injustices. And I'm making this point because I believe that if we want to see science as a global public good, then we want to ensure that the benefits of science get spread across the world evenly. And for benefits of science to manifest in their respective societies, it's important that we have the critical human resource to be able to do this. And here's a case where in all of our countries, we are making efforts to train these critical human resource. And here we are talking about the scientific critical human resource that is vital to the manifestation of the benefits of science. Unfortunately, because of the asymmetry of national wealth and sovereignty in our world, you find that critical human resources are developed in our part of the world, developing countries, and here let me be specific, Africa, and somehow they get to move into the much more endowed countries of the North. And so, well, I want to bring it into the discussion. If we are talking about social justice, we want to also address it at the international level. And so, in simple terms, I'm bringing into our discussion this afternoon the challenge of brain drain and how we should address it. The African Union Development Agency estimates that Africa loses about $2 billion annually through the migration of professionals, doctors, engineers, academics, to advanced countries such as the US, Canada, UK, and Australia. And these are the critical human resources that should manifest the benefits of science in our part of the world, in our societies, so our societies get to better appreciate science. And I can tell you, look, science itself has its own voice. And if we allow science to manifest in our societies, we will not even need to be loud in what science can do for the society. And so the point I want to make is this: so long as we are losing these critical scientific human resources from our part of the world to other countries, that's long we are inhibiting our people from getting the best of science. And it is something that we really need to address. If I should give one or two statistics and then move on to what probably we should be doing to address the problem, I like to cite the case of the UK having 6,770 Nigerian doctors on their National Health Service registered. I'm not talking about those who are not registered in the National Health Services. And Nigeria is a country where currently they only have about one doctor to 5,000 persons. And of course, that is much worse than the World Health Organization's recommendation of one doctor to 600 persons. Meanwhile, already, UK has roughly just one doctor to a little over 300 persons. So you see the disparity. And still we have our doctors moving from our part of the world and going to the advanced countries. And so it's an issue that we need to confront and address. And I know that there has been some initiatives, in fact, to the point where there have even been arguments that, look, let's not talk about brain drain, let's talk about brain gain. And there have been studies in some other developing countries to say that, oh, even as, for example, the US has relaxed migration for nurses and other health professionals, there has been more training of these health professionals, and so therefore there has been brain gain. Or that when these professionals who go outside come back to their home countries, they contribute better to health services, health care in those countries. I believe that these are arguments that beg the question of whether it is right for the limited resources of developing countries, of African countries, to be used to train these critical human resources and allow them to migrate to the better endowed advanced countries. And I'm saying this, that we ought to be able to discuss this within the context of social justice. And discussing this within the context of social justice means that we need to begin having bilateral, multilateral discussions on how we can put in place the necessary arrangements so that there should not only be compensation for these countries that lose these critical human resources, but also ensure that we have the due services from these critical human resources. And we can only do that if we appreciate the problem within the context of social justice. Thank you.
And our last speaker is Daya.
Thank you very much, Francois, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to talk about social justice in the context of fair access and participation with regard to an issue that concerned me greatly, certainly during my time as president of the International Science Council and chair at the time of its Committee on Freedom and Responsibility in Science. And that had to do with scientific communities and more specifically marginalized scientific communities. What I mean by that, why we should be concerned about that, what we should be doing about that. Well, let me begin by, in a sense, quantifying the issue for you. The UNESCO Science Report for 2021 gives, amongst other things, details of the number of researchers per million of population in countries around the world. So Europe, countries or regions or continents, as the case may be. So Europe, for example, has over 3,000 researchers per million of population. If you take a look at the Arab states, it's around 700. Latin America is around 600. So I'm comparing here with Europe, 3,300 thereabouts. Sub-Saharan Africa, 124. 124, 1/25th, roughly, of the number of researchers per million of population, okay, which is one statistic, in a sense, which kind of sums up the situation. So, in fact, it spells out in quite stark terms the position of, well, Africa, but the developing world more generally when it comes to being in a position really to participate as a member of the global scientific community in scientific advancements, sharing in the benefits of these advances, and, of course, contribute to advances as well. Now, one might say, well, such communities are part of the global science community. The International Science Council counts amongst its members, in Africa, it would be something like 27 or 28 countries that are represented in the ISC, and likewise Latin America, Asia, and so on. You have good representation. But the reality is that they're largely excluded communities, marginalized, even invisible. Little by way of connections to the mainstream of scientific work, limited resources, and prejudice, considerable prejudice from global research elites. Now, as scientists, we have some wonderful scientific freedoms. We ought to have anyway. But along with those go a number of responsibilities, weighty responsibilities. And you saw some of those earlier about conducting ourselves ethically, with fairness, pursuing excellence, and also ensuring that we share and that we bring those who are outside, beyond the margins of the scientific community into the fold so that they may also contribute in this way. Now, you know, the socioeconomic and cultural and gender diversity of research communities is not only a matter of social justice. In fact, the diversity of perspectives enriches insights, it informs the consequences, the assumptions of research, and also, in the very first place, it should inform the research agenda. They should be part of setting the agenda. So science and scientific research, in any case, are strengthened when shared. Talking, George, about brain drain and possibly brain gain, I like to think about brain circulation. You know, it's good. We mustn't just hold on to our scientists here. Allow them to go, collaborate, come back, others to come here so that you have healthy circulation. So anyway, you know, what are the prerequisites for successful actions? And Vivi has organized the session as well as, please, you know, not just the problems, but what are we going to do about it, and try to be concrete as well. Well, in the first place, let me say it's going to be essential to adopt a coordinated and networked approaches. We have to collaborate in addressing these problems through what you might call a consortium of diversified efforts. Also, and here I want to strike a somewhat positive tone by saying that we don't have to start from scratch. There are existing efforts that are in a position to serve as springboards for more focused and broad-ranging actions. There are many examples, but let me just give one example. The Inter-Academy Partnership is a global body whose members are academies. It has a number of regional networks. So let's talk about Africa. Its African regional network is called NASAC, the Network of African Science Academies, which has, I think, just short of 30 African members out of 54 countries in Africa. NASAC is in a perfect position to convene, to support, to work with others in promoting the kinds of efforts that are required in order to bring, in this case, African researchers into the fold. The ISC has regional focal points, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia Pacific, and we have a new, soon to be announced, regional focal point for Africa, which again will be perfectly positioned, and it will be part of its mandate, in fact, to engage in that kind of convening action. I want to say something about funding councils, because I think that funding or granting councils have a pivotal role to play here. Remember, we're talking about scientific communities that are marginalized. They are not part of the mainstream. They are not collaborating. They are not partners, at least not on an equal basis, with researchers elsewhere in the world. You know, granting councils have the ability to steer, and they often do, by focusing or giving priority to particular areas, say to multidisciplinary research, by requiring proposals to come from a multiplicity of institutions rather than a single group, and so on. In the same way, granting councils working together can use their power, as it were, to require that grant proposals be supported by or have within their consortium researchers or groups from the developed world, from the developing world as well, and in that way incentivize the development of such partnerships. So I think that they do have a major role to play, and in particular the African Science Granting Initiative for Sub-Saharan Africa has an important role to play in that regard. Also, still, you know, trying to strike a somewhat upbeat note, there are some wonderfully successful initiatives, which I think really should be supported and allowed to grow even further, such as the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which at the moment comprises 5 institutes, that is institutes in 5 African countries. Its mandate is graduate education and research. Imagine what AIMS would be able to do if it had 25 institutes instead of just the 5. Already it's making an impact. So I see that Francois is looking at me, and I need to wrap up. I could also mention the African Open Science Platform, which is really about to take off. A federated network comprising centers of cutting-edge research, capacity building, computing and other infrastructure, data repositories, and the like, founded on the principles of open science, which is in a position to make a substantial impact in towards achieving this objective of really bringing researchers on the margins into the center of things and to have them at the table. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I get to, sorry, can I have that last slide back up? I want to thank all the panelists for, I think, some really important and engaging contributions. I want to make a couple of comments and then open the floor. So the first thing is to let people know that we have copies of documents that really are the ISC's work. Here's the full, I don't have enough hands. Here's the summary report. Here's the full report. And I encourage you to pick up copies at the back if you need them or are interested, and obviously to share them with your communities. What I want to do now is very quickly share with you almost a bit of a summary of what I think I heard, and then invite you all to correct me if you've heard different things, or to add content that you think should be part of a conversation on social justice, to engage the panelists, but also to engage each other. One of the things that's unfortunate about conferences and the way they're set up is it tends to be this kind of a dialogue, but in fact there's no reason why it can't be this kind of a dialogue. You know, you might hear something that a colleague has said in the audience and you want to engage with that. So I'm going to encourage people to think in those terms broadly. The slide that's up there will stay up there while we have this conversation, and it's providing you with contact information for the International Science Council, which has sponsored this session, and of which some of us have been members or currently are members. So I just want to remind you a little bit of what I think has been said, and just to really highlight the variety of concerns that have been identified. So, you know, we heard first from Carisha basically some of the challenges when discrimination on the basis of gender and race intersect, and how they get played out in different geographies, how they have long-term repercussions. I mean, think about the failure of being able to share knowledge in a timely fashion. That influences people's lives because they don't get access to the benefits of research in a way and at a time that could benefit them. So there are real consequences. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in terms of social justice. What are the repercussions when we delay knowledge production or distort knowledge production? Sath shared with us, I think, some really important personal experiences of what it means to be an accomplished student, practitioner, scholar, and to constantly be making barriers. I can't imagine what it's like to have to sit there and somebody say, I'll take a chance on you, right? I'll take a chance on you. You know, because that's demeaning. It already says that you're risky, right? That you haven't, you know, made the grade in some sense. And so, you know, I think one of the things that I take away from that, though, is the movement and the interrogation to then say back to us as somebody who has experienced apartheid, how do I now need to think about it in a contemporary context with respect to Ukraine? And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to think about, the movement there. I think it's really important to hear very clearly, you know, what Daya contributed in terms of what it means to experience gender discrimination through almost a life cycle as a young girl and not having people to look up to in terms of mentors, in terms of then being able to imagine a particular kind of life and set of opportunities for yourself. But then when you somehow are able to reach beyond that, that you continue to meet those in the workplace and what those are like when they're sort of culturally instantiated. And again, I think, what's it like to be a successful scientist running a business and yet to constantly be worried about things like sexism and how they're going to play out in real life terms. I think, George reminds us of the brain drain problem and how that plays out, so that even when you have talent, you may not be able to reap the benefits of that talent. And one of the things that I've learned while I've been here is not only the brain drain from the African continent to other parts of the world, but also the brain drain between countries within Africa. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. How do we make it such that people who have the right to choose to move and whatnot want to choose differently, want to make a successful lives for themselves in a community where they can, in fact, share those benefits. And lastly, I think we heard from Daya really clearly about some of the challenges when we want to think about this, not in terms of individuals, again, but in terms of marginalized populations. And how can we imagine concrete ways in which those marginalized populations can be empowered so that they can, again, share their benefits with the community writ large. So those are the kinds of things that I heard. I invite you to have interpreted and heard different things and say them back. Also to ask questions, to comment. But as I said before, the talent, the intellectual talent in this room is not just on the stage, it's in the audience. And so you may have other ideas that you wish to contribute. So we have a microphone there. I'm going to keep one up here for the panelists. If you could, when you speak, please introduce yourself and where you're from. If you do happen to have a pointed question for one member of the panel, let me know and I'll make sure they get the microphone. And if it's just general, I'll invite the panelists to jump in as they are interested, engaged, see fit. So I'll open it up for comments and questions. Sorry, we've got one person over here.
Hello, my name is Gordon Dalton. I'm the chair of the International Consortium of Research Staff Associations. And I've got two questions. Is that possible?
Go for it. We'll see how many answers you get.
Yeah, one is for George, who's the president of the network for researchers called Africa LICS. I'm very interested to hear about that. This is a network of researchers in innovation in Africa. So could you tell me how this network may combat brain drain? How many members does the network have? And does the network collaborate with other international organizations for researchers like ICORSA, Eurodoc, and the GYA? And then the second question is for Daya, who's the chair of the ISC Committee for Freedom of Science and Responsibility in Science. I'm the coordinator, I was the coordinator of the RING project, a European project called Responsible Research and Innovation Network globally, with UNESCO as the lead partner. And we proposed that the UNESCO or SSR would be the global framework for responsible research and innovation. We did 4 case studies where 4 countries implemented the RING tools on their 4-yearly monitoring of the RSSR. And South Africa was one case study, and Lithuania with Rita here was another case study that successfully used the tools and will be using them again in the next 4-yearly monitoring. So I just wondered if you could comment on your committee for the freedom of responsibility, freedom of research and responsibility. How do you liaise with the UNESCO or SSR in that respect? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. Africa Leaks. Africa Leaks is the African network for the economics of learning, innovation, and competence building systems. That's a long one, but the short point of the network, the main concern of the network is to promote scholarship in innovation studies, and therefore we tend to bring interdisciplinary learning in science, technology, and innovation issues. The headquarters is in Nairobi, but then we have membership across the continent. I'm from Ghana, and I chair the Africa League Scientific Board. We organize research conferences. We organize PhD academies for PhD students. We organize visiting fellowship programs. We have mentorship programs for early career scholars. And so the membership are from the universities as well as research institutions. And as I said, the main goal of Africa Leagues is to promote scholarship in the cross-disciplinary studies of science, technology, and innovation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm no longer the chair of the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science, and I really should hand the mic over to Francoise or to Vivier. But let me respond briefly. So firstly, the ISC has embedded or enshrined in its statutes the principle of freedom and responsibility in science, which affirms a range of freedoms that scientists should enjoy, but also a range of responsibilities which we've alluded to in the course of this session. The committee's mandate really is to give effect to the principle in various ways. So, for example, much of its work is concerned with cases of individual and generic freedom. That is, in the case of individual scientific freedom, situations in which scientists are curtailed or maybe even harassed in the course, or even worse than that, in the course of carrying out, pursuing their scientific work. And the committee works with bodies such as Scholars at Risk in supporting such scientists and really ensuring that their rights are upheld. So I won't say any more than that, and Francois might want to say more, but I just wanted to mention, given your description of the work that you do, that I'm participating at the moment in a project, in a UNESCO project that is funded by SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, on scientific freedom in Africa. And the project centers around scientific freedom in 6 African countries, which are being treated as pilot studies, if you like, with a view really to expand later on. And the project is concerned with really taking a deep dive, looking at legislation and policy instruments, institutions, the enabling environment, in order to gain some insight into the state or the status of scientific freedom in those countries. I thought I'd just mention that, by the way. It's at a quite mature stage now, and we'll probably wrap up in the next month or so. Thank you.
Other people in the audience?
Thank you. It's Lita Borrell from Science Europe. Thank you for these testimonies and experience. And I heard a lot of things that perhaps in a less dramatic situation, I think, for example, you've been in prison, that's super dramatic. But this sentence you heard, I take a chance on you. We women hear it many times when we are hurt for the first time, for example. It's less dramatic. We have not been in prison normally, but that sentence got me as well, because I have heard it in me and my friends, and my female friends. And same with issues of brain drain. We in Europe, we have lots of issues of brain drain. We have tried to fight it for many years. And there have been great efforts. We have a European framework program that tries to help. We don't have any magic solution, but some advancements have been made, yet we are very conscious that we still have to work a lot more on that. So maybe there is here an opportunity to share some experiences about brain drain in other parts of the world, so that maybe we can avoid some mistakes, or we can just simply learn from what have been other solutions that have been tested and maybe or may not applicable in African context or in other contexts. But I was surprised because the challenges that you mentioned are not African by themselves. Of course, there is a context, an African context, but these exist in other parts of the world. And I know best Europe because where I live in, but I'm sure if we will go to Latin America, we would find the same type of issues. So I don't know, maybe there is something that we can try and understand for structural reasons in different parts of the world that lead to this inequity in science, for example.
Okay, before I invite any of the panelists to comment, I'd actually like to hear from other people in the audience. I mean, here's your opportunity to do that kind of crosstalk. I mean, are there other people that have had similar experiences or that have a different perspective with respect to the universal experience of that kind of challenge?
Hello. I want to share something, but not a personal experience, if I may. The ISC is also involved, has been working with UNESCO on their study, looking at, normatively looking at scientific freedom and responsibility within the African context, and then looking at the policies and procedures with which to monitor their standard, their standard setting document. And what really struck me, and we know this, is that the conversation was focused very much on issues of access and less on benefiting from science. And access was huge, access to even enter into science. And one of those, at a very sort of gross national level, one of that is the amount of resources going into science. And through the African Union, there's a commitment for an aspirational commitment for African countries to meet the 1% of GDP target from the national budget to fund scientific research. And that very, very first step, enabling access, is really difficult to achieve. And now I'm all about discussing this, but what is our role as the organized scientific community to advocate, to push? What power do we have? What are the avenues for which to influence these targets? And how do we do that? And I don't know what role, if any, at a national level, organized science plays in that budget game, in that game of national priorities with respect to science, knowing the huge influence it has on education, on growth, on innovation. Sorry, a bit of a...
No, thanks for those comments. Vivi's trying to remind us that we need to be sort of pointed and forward-looking and strategic in terms of what are some of the solutions that we could actually try to implement. There was a comment just behind Vivi.
This is a quick one, just to add to Seth's comments. I'm younger than Seth, but I think anyone who was an anti-apartheid activist in the 80s would have struggled to get any type of formal support, whether it's finances, for masters and PhDs, etc. So in my case, for example, I literally did a first draft of a PhD on the Group Areas Act, which deals with segregation, without a supervisor. I didn't have a supervisor, and I started doing, when you work without a supervisor, you make literally every possible mistake that you can make in research. So recently I was asked to write about my academic life using, and I didn't know about this method, autoethnography. And it forced me to reflect on these experiences. And what you find is, I think those experiences actually make you more resilient. It makes you stronger. And I think I always say, whatever challenges I faced as a student, my students must not experience those challenges. You try to make the training experiences more pleasant, a more supportive one. I just thought I wanted to just connect that with SATS. I could speak at length about what happened. Thank you.
Yeah, of course there are serious resonances in terms of our experiences. And there is a historic fact which we need to look at. Firstly, chattel slavery, the advent of colonialism, and the decisions taken in the West African Conference on the Congo River Basin, some 137 years ago, resulted in a majority of European countries and the US carving up Africa. We still have the residue now, where extraction economies continue unabated. And I dare say that if the reparations movement begun, that have started over time in the Caribbean, in the US with the Black Lives Matter resurgence, you'll find that riches that Europeans and North Americans rely on come from elsewhere in the world. So there's a gross imbalance. That imbalance needs to be rectified. The extractions, you look at who funds what. The extractions result in huge R&D for the developed world. And, I looked at the draft statement that was put out yesterday, as I'm sure many of you did, and there's almost a blaming of Africa for not coming up with money. And yet they face total extraction, corruption, of course. Tomorrow is the International Day against anti-corruption, right? So that equity continues to be ignored, and particularly the scientific community. So when you raise these issues, people say, oh, that's politics. It's not politics, it's reality, it's history. And we can't ignore the nightmares of the past because they visit us in the present, and our children will continue to exhibit them. So that area needs to be addressed. I'm ashamed to say that a few years ago, ICSU decided on control of the votes. So it's not one country, one vote. It's based on how much you pay. That inequity persists in the ISC statutes. So it's that kind, we say international scientific organizations, we don't participate on equal terms. The perpetuation of inequity, inequality, and exclusion are replete in these institutions. So unless we deal with that kind of approach, we're not going to come to the conversations we really need, because the scale is totally unbalanced.
Yeah, so on a totally different note, maybe not totally different sets, but I think, when we gather like this, we can, we think about ourselves as one humanity, one planet, and what we can do. And we know that global solidarity can, and unity of purpose can really help us achieve a lot. So I think that, we can talk and talk about the differences and the many challenges that face us. But I also think that we have an opportunity to look at how do we come up with solutions. And maybe we can't solve all the problems, but one of the things we can do is look at the issue of science as a social public good or as a public good, which is one of the ISC's taglines as well. And I think that even though with, and please forgive me for going back to HIV, because I do think there's some important lessons there where we saw scientific discovery in the form of treatment, combination therapy that was only available in industrialized countries, cost a fortune, and 70% of the infections in Africa, and people are dying. Life expectancy drops from 60 plus to under, just over 40. And the impact of that is still being felt today. But through activism, through having that scientific breakthrough, through coming together, we were able to bring that drug price down to $1 a day. And through commitments, political will, and solidarity, we were able to ensure that that same triple therapy was not only affordable, but accessible, and active programs put into place to deliver that. Some of those battles had to be fought with the judiciary, through the judiciary rather, reminding us that multidisciplinary approaches are important, co-knowledge generation is important, but also co-knowledge generation enabling us to co-own what the products of that are. So I think there's some way there when we think in contrast to COVID-19, where there was unity of purpose in our quest for a vaccine. And we got that amazingly, miraculously, some may say, in less than a year. But where the rubber hit the tar was when it came to access and distribution. And that still hasn't been sorted out. So are we going to learn and relearn these lessons, or can we start with a completely collective approach? What are the things we want to do? And if we pick 4 or 5 things we want to focus on and work with solidarity, with unity of purpose, can we get that? And I think those are the kinds of things where we may want to agree. There's no question about widening inequities and inequalities, but we can talk and talk till we're blue in the face. It's been there. It's getting worse. And it's not getting better. So what is it we can do? And my one thought that I want to put on the table is that we have a whole cohort of children whose lives have been completely disrupted with COVID-19. And in a way that is much worse than anything we saw during the worst of the AIDS pandemic. And what we also know from science and many different scientific disciplines is the first 1,000 days of a child's life is critically important for that child's lifelong trajectory. And to me, it could be a rallying point of trying to get a whole cohort of children that are born that never have this kind of experience and expertise. Is that aspirational? Is it too much? Somebody reminded us the other day that come 2034, every other child born will be born in Africa. That's 50% of the children globally. But let's go to, can we ensure that every child born has the same opportunity across the globe? At least we'll start at one end to fix the problem of inequities as we continue to try and fix the existing inequalities.
Thanks. Other comments? We have stunned everybody into silence. Okay, well, in that context, sorry, Daya, you wanted to add something? Sorry, I'll send this down.
Thanks. It's just a very brief point. In responding to the question earlier about the committee's work and so on, I should have mentioned probably the most important work that the committee did at the time was to work towards the publication of a report on freedom and responsibility in science in the 21st century. So there are copies here, right?
I'm downstairs.
And downstairs. Oh, you have it already, right. So this is the thing. Notions of freedom and responsibility in science have been around for a long time, but the 21st century presents particular challenges, both in respect of scientific freedom and the responsibility of scientists. And I think that it's really important that we as a global scientific community, as individuals and through our national, regional bodies and global bodies such as the International Science Council, first of all, work with our colleagues to ensure that these responsibilities are carried out in the way in which they are set out in the principle, ethical behavior, sharing, bringing others on board, and furthermore, to ensure that these scientific freedoms are upheld. And there are many parts of the world where they are not, where scientists are not free to carry out their work, where they do not have equitable access and so on. So as a community as a whole, there are others as well who should be doing this work, but I'm talking about the scientific community, which has a significant responsibility to work towards these goals.
Okay. Thank you. I thought that Vivi raised an issue which we really need to highlight in our discussion, and it has to do with the investment of 1% GDP of African countries in research and development. And I thought I should make a contribution to that. The fact is that this 1% of GDP investments in scientific research goes as far back as 1980, when we did the plan, Lagos Plan of Action, and African heads of states in Lagos committed willingly to be investing that level of their GDP in scientific research. And it has carried on into the 20s. And I thought I should comment on that because in Minister Pando's lecture, one of the points she made in her conclusion is that if we don't fully fund our knowledge institutions in scientific research, we cannot participate in global science. And I thought it was a very important point that she was making to answer the question of why are we so alienated in global science as African nations. It has to do with the fact that we are not investing to the level that we should be able to build capacity in this. Of course, I've taken serious note of what my brother Sachs has said about the structural inequalities and all that. However, I think that we still have a lot of work to do in our home countries. And as we go forward with the discussions on STI policy, as we go forward to the discussions of formulating and designing STI roadmaps for the SDGs, I hope that we can impress on political leadership on our continent that we cannot run away from investing in scientific research. Otherwise, you will be lost in the global science. Thank you.
Can I add? I just want to add some solution I experiment during my journey, I think it's very important to work on the narrative, so young women can know there are a lot of possibilities, and then they can be whatever they want. So work on narrative. It is for advertising, press, artists, cartoon, to break stereotype and prejudice about girl ability to do science. I think it's very important. For me, when I was young, my father used to buy a lot of books, so I had to read a lot to see what is this possibility and to choose what I want to do. And today, computer science is like a passion, and I can serve my community with this passion, and I think it's important. And the last one is to have support. This morning they talk about it in the session about mentoring. I think it's very important for young girls to have this kind of support during their journey, to have access to science. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to all of the panelists. Please join me in thanking. Oh, I'm going to have to ask you to take that conversation up afterwards, if you don't mind. Partly because we're at the end of our time. But I think I just invite everybody to please join me in thanking the panelists, and then I have a couple of remarks. I think what I'd like to say by way of closing is I think the comments that have been made by various people suggest to me that actually we need to make some systemic changes in a number of arenas. We've heard about the importance of looking at what's happening in our educational system, looking at what's happening in the scientific system, and it is a system in terms of there are power and control and structures, thinking about what needs to be done in social, legal, and political systems as well. And I think the bottom line is that no one person can take on all of those challenges. And so I think the interesting thing might be for people to look at where they have both talent and opportunity, and they can identify a particular problem that they can turn their attention to in order to try and make this world a better place for us all. And with that, I thank you very much, and I hope to see some of you at the gala dinner tonight. Thank you.
you.